Okay, welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to be covering muscles of the upper extremity. And to start with, I want to go over the rotator cuff muscles first. I just think they're very interesting. I think we hear of a lot of rotator cuff injuries. We hear and have heard of people saying they tore their rotator cuff. We hear people say they had rotator cuff repair surgery. So, what is the rotator cuff? And I want to give you a little bit of information on that. So, in this image right here, we're looking at the scapula. This is why osteology was so important, because we know here's the vertebral border or medial border of the scapula. Here's the spine of the scapula. That's the acromion process from the back. Here's the acromion process from the front. Here's the coracoid process. Here's the clavicle, and here's the humerus. So this is the posterior view, and here's the anterior view. When we look at the posterior view, we know we're looking at the posterior because we see the spine of the scapula. Above the spine of the scapula was a fossa called the supraspinous fossa. Below it was the infraspinous fossa. And on the anterior scapula was the subscapular fossa. So the reason why those three fosses are interesting is because we have three muscles that originate on those fosses, and their names of the muscles sound just like similar to the fossa. So the supraspinatus muscle can be found originating on the supraspinous fossa. The infraspinatus originates on the infraspinous fossa. And the subscapularis originates on the subscapular fossa. Now, Teres Minor doesn't originate on a fossa. It actually originates right here on the medial border of the scapula. The other thing I want to point out to you is that the supraspinatus, the infraspinatus, and the Teres Minor, all three of these muscles that are on the posterior, are going to insert onto the humerus where the greater tubercle lies. So the greater tubercle was an important landmark of the proximal humerus. On the anterior side here, we see the subscapularis, which originates on the subscapular fossa, but that one does not insert on the greater tubercle. It inserts on the lesser tubercle. So here's the lesser tubercle, here's the greater tubercle, and right there is the bicipital groove. And there's a few muscles that insert here on the bicipital groove. One of them is the pec major, and one of them is teres major, and one of them is the Latissimus Dorsi. So three of them actually attach somewhere right there in the groove. Pec major, teres major, and the lats. And there's a tendon that travels right through here, and that's the Biceps Brachii. That tendon travels right through here. Okay, so the rotator cuff muscles are sometimes called the sits muscles. Sits, S-I-T, and the last S is for the subscapularis. Okay, so now that I showed you those muscles, let me go to my whiteboard for a second. And I want to show you if I do S, I, T, S. So here's the sits muscles. Again, it stands for supraspinatus, infraspinatus, teres minor. I'll put a little M here for minor. And then we have the subscapularis, right? So here's just a good way for you to study these. The first three, the supraspinatus, infraspinatus, and teres minor, those insert on the greater tubercle of the humerus. And where did I say the subscapularis inserts? We said the lesser tubercle of the proximal humerus. So that's the first bit of information that you can get from this little graph chart here. The second is that the supraspinatus, the infraspinatus, and the subscapularis, the ones that I circled with the O for origin, those three originate on their corresponding fosses. So the supraspinatus originates on the supraspinous fossa. The infraspinatus originates on the infraspinous fossa. And the subscapularis originates on the subscapular fossa. So three of the four originate on their corresponding fosses. Teres Minor, I didn't circle it with an O because it does not originate on a fossa. It originates on the vertebral border of the scapula. The last thing I want to point out are their actions. And their actions are going to be AB, EX, EX, IN. Now you may be asking, what does EX and IN stand for? A lot of people jump and think EX stands for extension, but it doesn't. Remember, EX and IN are antagonistic actions to each other. EX stands for external rotation, and IN would be for internal rotation. So the supraspinatus abducts or abducts the shoulder. The infraspinatus and teres minor both externally rotate the shoulder. And the subscapularis internally rotates the shoulder. AB, EX, EX, IN. So let me show you what that looks like. And make sure you watch my video on YouTube, on my YouTube channel. I do have a video purely going over all the ranges of motion and what they actually look like, because there's really no benefit in just memorizing, okay, the supraspinatus abducts, the infraspinatus and teres minor externally rotate, and subscapularis internally. There's no benefit of just memorizing that information without visually seeing it in your head as to what those actions look like. So it's important that you know what they look like. Okay, so on me, right, here is abduction. When I bring my arm out to the side, that's abduction. When I bring my arm and rotate it this way, that's external rotation. When I rotate my arm down, that's internal rotation. So the way this mnemonic goes, and I would suggest you do it with me, I know it looks silly, but it goes like this: AB, EX, EX, IN. AB, EX, EX, IN. Abduction, external rotation, internal rotation. AB, EX, EX, IN, S, I, T, S, sits. Supraspinatus abducts, infraspinatus externally rotates, teres minor externally rotates, subscapularis internally rotates. AB, EX, EX, IN. Those are the actions of the rotator cuff muscles. Okay, now let's go to the muscles themselves. Let's go to the upper extremity. And why don't we start with the rotator cuff muscles, since that was what we just went over. Let's see, which one do I want to go through first? You know what? Let's start here. All right. Now, keep in mind, and there's two ways of looking at these, right? When you look at the picture, if you just click on it, it's going to show it without the muscles named. If you click on the label, then you get the muscles labeled. All right. Now, keep in mind that this arm, let me just show it to you for a second. If you look at the way the models are situated, you'll see that it's on a stand. You see down here at the bottom, there's that stem. It's actually on a stand, so the upper extremity is this way, right? It's upside down. We're accustomed to reviewing it with the arm hanging down. So the orientation of this may throw you off a little bit at first because we're looking at the arm upward in this position rather than hanging downward. So I want to point that out so that you're not confused. So here we can see, here's the stem, here's the spine of the scapula. So the supraspinatus is here because it's above the spine of the scapula, but here in this reading position, it looks like it's inferior or below it, but you have to flip this upside down, right? It's opposite of this right now, right? We're looking at this upside down, so it should be S-I-T. We're going to be looking at it upside down, so you're going to see T-I-S right now. Okay, so here is the supraspinatus. Here is the infraspinatus. It's pretty large. And then right here is Teres Minor. Now remember, if there's a Teres Minor, if there's a minor, there's going to be a major. But remember, SIT, it's minor, that's the rotator cuff muscle, not Teres Major. The one that's torn most commonly is the supraspinatus. That's the one that's injured the most. A lot of people in baseball that are pitchers, they'll often tear the Teres Minor because the Teres Minor is an external rotator. And if you think of a baseball pitch, when they start from this position and they throw and accelerate the ball, when they're throwing, that mechanism is internal rotation. So what is stopping a pitch at 100 miles an hour is not an internal rotator. It has to be an external rotator, right? The antagonistic muscle is activating to contract eccentrically to slow down that internal rotation. So what's going to get torn are one of the external rotators. And it's usually not infraspinatus because it's a pretty large muscle. It's the smaller one that's going to blow out first, which is Teres Minor. So you have supraspinatus, infraspinatus, Teres Minor, SIT. The last one, the subscapularis, is on the opposite side. It's on the anterior side of the scapula, but you can't quite see it from this perspective. The other thing that I want you to see is that here's Teres Major, and it looks like it's wrapping around to the other side of the humerus. Remember, supraspinatus, infraspinatus, and Teres Minor are all inserting on the same place on the greater tubercle. What's on the other side is the lesser tubercle. And that's where Teres Major is going to insert pretty close to that lesser tubercle side, but a little bit further in. It's actually going to attach to the bicipital groove. So you have these three going to the greater tubercle, this one attaching just past the lesser tubercle on the bicipital groove. But this one here, this is the triceps. This is the long head of the triceps. And it pierces or it gets sandwiched. It's a landmark, right? Because it's unique. It's unique in that you don't often see one muscle getting sandwiched between two others like this. So you have the long head of the triceps, and that gets sandwiched between Teres Minor and Teres Major. Now, since these two are on opposite sides of the bone, it would mean if they're on opposite sides of the bone in terms of function, they're antagonistic to one another. So whatever Teres Minor does, Teres Major has to do the opposite if they're on opposite sides of the bone. So if Teres Minor is an external rotator of the shoulder, what is Teres Major? An internal rotator of the shoulder, as is the subscapularis. Okay? Plus, the supraspinatus originates on the supraspinous fossa. The infraspinatus originates on the infraspinous fossa. And the subscapularis, which is on the other side, originates on the subscapular fossa. So let's take a look at that one. So we did that. Let's look at here. Now we're looking at the scapula and the humerus. Remember, it's upside down. It's on a stand. So here's the clavicle. This is the clavicular portion of pec major, because pec major has a sternal division and it has a clavicular division. Here's the teres major. Not teres minor, but teres major. And here, this entire muscle that takes up the full space of the subscapular fossa is the subscapularis. That's an internal rotator. This is the coracoid process. And it looks like there's two muscles that attach to the coracoid process. This is why osteology was so important. So here's the coracoid process. This is the Biceps Brachii, the short head of the Biceps Brachii, and the one adjacent to it is the Coracobrachialis. If you look at the name, Coracobrachialis, brachium is arm, coraco from the coracoid process. So this muscle is named by its origin and insertion. Coracoid process to the arm, coracoid process to the arm, Coracobrachialis. Okay, so I wanted to cover the rotator cuff muscles there first for you. Now let's look at the arm here. Let's zoom in a little bit. Now here is the clavicular division of pec major, right there. That's the clavicular division of pec major, and that inserts on the bicipital groove. Here's your deltoid, named after the shape, delta. The deltoid has an anterior division, a middle division, and a posterior division. And when you watch my video on ranges of motion, you will learn that if a muscle is in front, it has to move that extremity to the front. If a muscle is on the outside, it has to move the extremity outward to the outside. And if a muscle fiber is on the back, it has to move the extremity to the back. Now, you can't say that on a test, right? You can't say moves the arm to the front or moves the arm to the back or moves the arm to the outside. Those aren't official actions. You would have to use the appropriate terminology. So the anterior deltoid flexes the shoulder. The posterior deltoid extends the shoulder. The middle deltoid abducts the shoulder. When we move down and we look at the arm and then we look at the forearm and the hand, just so you can see the orientation of it, because the arm, we're looking at it more from the side view, we can see the orientation from anterior to posterior near the humerus or the arm. So anterior is the biceps, antagonistic on the posterior is the triceps. Now the bicep means two, tricep, tri means three. So the bicep has two heads, a short head and a long head. What we see from the lateral view is the long head of the biceps. The short head is more medial, and that one originates off the coracoid process. Here is the triceps. The triceps has a lateral head, and if there's a lateral head, there'll be a medial head, but we can't see that because we're looking at it from the lateral view. And then there is a long head. of the triceps. The long head I showed you in that picture before when I was going over the rotator cuff muscles. We saw the long head of the triceps piercing between teres minor and teres major. These are antagonists. The biceps and triceps are antagonists. One's on the anterior, one's on the posterior, so they're going to do opposite things. Because the biceps crosses the shoulder and the elbow, Lindner's rule is that if it crosses the joint, it has to move the joint. So if a muscle crosses the shoulder, it's got to move the shoulder. If a muscle crosses the elbow, it's got to move the elbow. Well, how is it going to move it? Well, at the shoulder, since it's in front, it's going to flex the shoulder. If the biceps flexes the shoulder, what does the triceps do at the shoulder? Well, it's got to do the opposite. It has to extend the shoulder. If the biceps flex the elbow, what do the triceps do at the elbow? Extend the elbow. They do opposites. Now, the biceps do one other thing at the elbow. The biceps supinate. The biceps supinate. So if you're holding a screwdriver in your hand and you're in this position with your elbow bent at 90 degrees and you try to tighten something with your right hand, if you put your left hand where your bicep is on the right and you elbow is bent at 90 degrees and you try to rotate clockwise like you're tightening something with a screwdriver, you'll feel your biceps contract. So the biceps brachii is a very strong supinator when your elbow is bent at 90 degrees. When the elbow is extended, if you try and tighten something, your biceps are not going to contract in supination. You'll have another muscle called a supinator that does that, that's much, much weaker. So your biceps brachii doesn't only flex the elbow, it's a very, very strong supinator. Okay, between the biceps and the triceps is another powerful elbow flexor called the brachialis. Okay, so you have biceps brachii and brachialis. Those are big muscles, they're in the arm. And there's one other muscle that's an elbow flexor, but it starts more at the distal end of the humerus, and that's called a Brachioradialis. It originates near that lateral epicondyle of the humerus. It goes all the way down and inserts on the radial styloid, or the styloid process of the radius. And that's how it gets its name, Brachioradialis, because it originates on the brachium, which is the humerus. It's just the distal end of the humerus, just above the lateral epicondyle. It's called the lateral supracondylar ridge, and it inserts on the styloid process of the radius. In fact, it's the only muscle in the body that originates at the distal end of one bone and goes to the distal end of another bone. It's the only muscle in the body that goes from the end of one bone and goes to the end of another bone. And it's the distal ends, because the lateral epicondyle is the lateral end of the humerus. It's the distal end of the humerus, whereas the radial styloid is the distal end of the radius. So it's the only muscle in the body that goes from the distal end of one bone and goes to the distal end of another. It too is an elbow flexor, the brachioradialis, but it flexes the elbow in the neutral position, right? This is flexing in the supinated position. This is flexing in the neutral position, like your hand shaking, and this is flexing in the pronated position. So the biceps brachii is the strongest flexor in the supinated position. The brachioradialis is a strong flexor in the neutral handshaking position. And the brachialis is the strongest in the pronated position. And that's why if you ever see people strengthening their arm muscles, they sometimes do curls with dumbbells and they do it in different positions, supinated, neutral, they call them hammer curls, or in a pronated position to strengthen the brachialis. Okay, in the forearm, we're looking at the posterior side here, and there's a rule that I want you to understand, and I need you to look at me, and I also need to look at your own forearms when we do this. So when you look at your anterior forearm and you flex your fingers, you'll see that if you put your left hand over your right medial epicondyle and you go just distal to it on the forearm, there's a bulk of muscle here. And if you put your fingertips and dig it right in there, and then you flex your fingers, you'll see that those pop out where your fingers are palpating on your forearm. It pops out because the muscles are contracting. If you flex your wrist, it does the same thing. They pop out. So all of your finger flexors and wrist flexors, the majority of them are going to originate somewhere on that medial epicondyle of the humerus. So all of your wrist flexors and finger flexors are found on the anterior forearm. Well, if all the flexors of the wrist and fingers are found on the anterior forearm, what's going to be on the posterior forearm? All of the wrist extensors and finger extensors. So if you go on the posterior side where the lateral epicondyle is, and you extend your wrist, you're going to see and wiggle your fingers, you're going to see movement along the lateral epicondyle. And if you extend the wrist, the same thing, those muscles start to pop out. So that's an important concept, so that you know whenever you're looking at the back of the hand or the back of the fingers or the back of the forearm, you're going to see the word extensor in most of those muscles. And then when you're looking at, you see all these extensor carpi ulnaris, extensor digitorum, extensor carpi radialis brevis, extensor carpi radialis longus. Anytime you see muscles or tendons on the back side, you're thinking, all right, since it's on the back, these have to be extensors of something. And then when they're on the front, you're thinking, okay, this has to flex something. Is it going to flex the wrist or flex the fingers? Well, the determining factor to that is just literally following the muscle and seeing where the tendons go to. So if the tendons go to the fingers, we know that those are called the digits, so extensor digitorum. If it doesn't go to the digits but stops at the carpal bones, then it's an extensor carpi something. Well, the something, now you have to go extensor carpi what? Is it on the ulnar side or is it on the radial side? This one is on the ulnar side, so it's an extensor carpi ulnaris. Now, if there's an extensor carpi ulnaris, there's going to be an extensor carpi radialis. And we can see these on the radial side. One of them has a longer tendon and is more proximal up here, right? If it's more proximal, it does have to have a longer tendon to make it to the end of the wrist. And the extensor carpi radialis brevis, since it originates more distally, it has a shorter tendon. So that's why it's called brevis. It's named by the size of the tendons. If they have a long tendon, it's a longus. And if it has a shorter tendon, it's a brevis. Okay, then down near the thumb, just proximal to the thumb, there are two bellies right here. One is an extensor pollicus brevis. And if there's an extensor pollicus brevis, there has to be an extensor pollicus longus, and it is. It's this tendon right here. That's the longer tendon. So here's extensor pollicus brevis. This one's extensor pollicus longus. And proximal to the extensor pollicus brevis is the abductor pollicus longus. Now remember, pollicus means thumb. These three muscles, 1, 2, and 3, make up a spot, this little depression at the base of the thumb, called the anatomical snuff box. If you raise your thumb up in the, like hitchhiking or a thumbs up position, there's a depression that you can feel right here. Everyone has it. And when you raise your thumb up, you can see the tendons here. There's a little depression right there. That's called the anatomical snuff box. And it's made by those three muscles, the abductor pollicus longus, the extensor pollicus longus, and extensor pollicus brevis, those three. They call it the snuff box because old days people would put cocaine in here. They put it here and snort it. It's the anatomical snuff box. It's crazy to think that, but a part of the anatomy was named after how people consume drugs, the anatomical snuff box. It's crazy, but that's how it earned its name. Another important structure here is this soft tissue band that looks like it would be the back of a watch, right here, or a bracelet. This is called the extensor retinaculum. Extensor retinaculum. If there's an extensor retinaculum, there's going to be a flexor retinaculum. The extensor retinaculum holds down all of these extensor tendons. The extensor retinaculum holds down all of the extensor tendons on the back of the wrist. The flexor retinaculum will hold down all the flexor tendons of the wrist. Okay, so let's look at, we did the posterior. Let's look at the anterior side. So remember, here's the anterior scapula. So that's the subscapularis. There's Teres Major. Now we're looking at the arm. And in the front, we could see the biceps brachii. Remember, bi means two, so it's long head and short head. So which one originates on the coracoid process? It's the short head. Important to know that. The long head travels through the bicipital groove of the humerus. Now, here is the triceps brachii. Now, on the medial side, before in the other view, we could see the lateral head. Now on the inside, we could see the medial head and the long head. And it is the long head that pierces or gets sandwiched between Teres Minor and Teres Major. The biceps flex the shoulder and flex the elbow. The triceps extend the shoulder and extend the elbow. The biceps brachii, in addition to flexing the shoulder and flexing the elbow, it supinates the forearm. It does forearm supination. The biceps does shoulder flexion, elbow supination. Triceps, shoulder extension, elbow extension. If you're ever asked actions, and you will be, on the exam, it's important to write as little as possible. So if you're asked, what is the action of this muscle? You would simply say, shoulder extension, 2 words. Elbow extension, 2 words. No need to write extension of the elbow. No need to write flexion of the elbow. You simply put the joint first and then the action. Elbow, flexion. Elbow or forearm, supination. Shoulder flexion. So always put the joint or the body part first and then the action. You don't have to put of the. You wouldn't put flexion of the wrist, flexion of the hip, external rotation of the shoulder. You would just put shoulder, external rotation, shoulder, extension, hip, flexion, hip, extension. The joint comes first and then the action. Okay, let's look at the forearm now. Remember what I said earlier, when we put our hand over the medial epicondyle, so here's the right hand. If you place your left hand here along the lateral epicondyle and you flex your fingers, you feel movement and pulsing of all of these muscles here. These are the wrist and finger flexors. So if you put, and I'm going to demonstrate this on myself here, if you take your right hand and you put it over your left medial epicondyle and you display your first four fingers, your thumb, your index, your middle, and your ring finger, but you put your thenar pad of your thumb right over the medial epicondyle like this, and then you display your thumb, your first, your middle, and your ring finger right over that. These four fingers are going to represent the four muscles that I'm about to go over. Your thumb represents the Pronator Teres. Your pointer finger represents the Flexor Carpi Ulnaris. Your middle finger going right down the center of the palm is the Palmaris Longus. And then your ring finger, which is on the ulnar side, is Flexor Carpi Ulnaris. The pinky is nothing. So it's just those four fingers. So again, your thumb would have been going along here at Pronator Teres. Your pointer finger would be on the thumb side, on the radial side, which is Flexor Carpi Radialis. Your middle finger, when it was displayed, was going down the center of the palm. That's the Palmaris Longus. And then your ring finger was going along the ulnar side. That's the Flexor Carpi Ulnaris. So they all originate off of that medial epicondyle. The Pronator Teres pronates the hand or pronates the forearm. The Flexor Carpi Radialis, Palmaris Longus, and Flexor Carpi Ulnaris, they all cross the wrist, so they're going to flex the wrist. If they cross the joint, it acts on the joint. Here is the Flexor Retinaculum, that ligament that runs transversely here. Remember on the other side, it was the Extensor Retinaculum. Here's the Flexor Retinaculum. And you'll see that the finger flexor tendons, which I haven't gone over yet, but all of these finger flexors go underneath the retinaculum. So the flexor retinaculum, aka transverse carpal ligament, aka volar ligament, there's three names of it: volar ligament, transverse carpal ligament, flexor retinaculum. This tendon, or ligament, I should say, not tendon, but this ligament goes from your carpal bones on the radial side to the carpal bones on the ulnar side, and it makes up the roof of the carpal tunnel. That ligament is the roof, whereas the carpal bones are the floor. So you have a roof, and then you have a floor. And then through the tunnel is the nerve, the median nerve, and all these flexor tendons. So you've heard of carpal tunnel syndrome. If the finger flexors hypertrophy or get larger and thicker, then that can put pressure on the median nerve, giving you carpal tunnel syndrome, where you get numbness and tingling down the thumb, the pointer, the middle, and half of the ring finger, 3.5 fingers. You can get lightning, shooting pain, or numbness and tingling. And that's due to compression of the median nerve in the carpal tunnel. I also want you to look at the Palmaris Longus for a second. And if you look at that tendon and you hone in on it, it's superficial to the flexor retinaculum. The other ones are deep in it, right? Like they go right through it or underneath it. But the Palmaris Longus is superficial, actually crosses superficial to it and attaches to the superficial palm. Now, if you also look in, I pointed out to these flexor tendons of the fingers. The belly of the flexor digitorum muscles, if we look deep to these superficial ones that we just discussed, deep in here, we can see here's a belly of a muscle between these two tendons. And then here's a belly of a muscle. And then here's a belly of the muscle. What's deep is the flexor digitorum superficialis, right? There's the word superficial. Flexor digitorum superficialis. That's what these tendons, or where these tendons come from. They come from the belly of the flexor digitorum superficialis. Here's the Brachioradialis from this view. Okay, let's take a look and see if we can see the flexor digitorum superficialis from a different view. Let me look at this one first, just to hone in again. There's the Pronator Teres. Here's your flexor Carpi radialis. Here's your Palmaris Longus. And there's the flexor Carpi ulnaris. Now, all three of these, since they cross the wrist, they have to act on the wrist, so they all flex the wrist. Pronator Teres doesn't cross the wrist. It just goes from the medial epicondyle to the proximal forearm. So it pronates the forearm, but the hand comes along for the ride, right? When you supinate and pronate, it's the forearm that moves, but the hand has no choice, but it comes along for the ride. Palmaris longus purely flexes the wrist, but the flexor Carpi radialis can flex the wrist, but since it's on the radial side, it abducts the wrist or radially deviates it. Whereas the flexor Carpi ulnaris not only flexes the wrist, but it adducts the wrist, or ulnar deviates it like a karate chop in that position. Now let me show you the superficialis, the flexor digitorum superficialis. Okay, so in this view here, here's the forearm, here's the hand, and right here at the proximal portion, you see the muscles that we just discussed, the ones where I put my thumb and my three other fingers along the forearm, the Pronator Teres, the flexor Carpi ulnaris, Palmaris longus, and flexor Carpi ulnaris. So the radialis, ulnaris, and Palmaris longus are cut. Right here are the tendons from where they were cut. Right there's the flexor Carpi radialis. Here's the Palmaris longus. You can see that it's cut. The flexor Carpi ulnaris is still intact because it's more medial. You can see it here. There's the belly of it. It's still intact. It inserts at the pisiform. But the flexor Carpi radialis and the Palmaris longus muscles are cut, so we can see, here's the flexor digitorum superficialis. You know what, let me go back one, because I think it's this one I really want. Here, there it is. So here's the tendon of the flexor Carpi radialis. Here's the tendon of the Palmaris longus. Here is the flexor digitorum superficialis. You can see I was pointing it out between these two tendons in the last view. We could see it here, we could see it here, we could see it here. Remember, what was cut were the muscles that originated here off the medial epicondyle. Those were the Pronator Teres, the flexor Carpi radialis, ulnaris, and Palmaris longus. So we cut these two so we can see the belly of it. It's the flexor digitorum superficialis. So there, it's the largest muscle of the forearms anterior. It's the largest muscle of the forearms anterior. If we follow it down, it goes underneath the flexor retinaculum. And you could see here, 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 and here. Those are the tendons of the flexor digitorum superficialis. Okay, now let's go back. Let's go back to this one again. So now we cut the flexor digitorum superficialis. We cut that muscle, which is superficial, and deep to that is another flexor muscle of the digits called the Flexor Digitorum Profundus. This is Flexor Digitorum Superficialis because it's superficial. We cut it, and deep to that is the Flexor Digitorum Profundus. Both of these are major finger flexors of digits 2 to 5, digits 2, 3, 4, and 5. Those go underneath the Flexor Retinaculum. And now when you look at the fingers, we can see where they insert. Here's the tendons of the Flexor Digitorum Superficialis. They go to digits 2, 3, 4, and 5. But what I want you to notice is that the tendons come down and they make a split. There's like a fork in the road. One goes to the medial side, one goes to the lateral side. It creates a tunnel. It does that of all the digits, 2, 3, 4, and 5. It creates a split, and through that split or tunnel comes the deeper one, which is the tendon of the Flexor Digitorum Profundus. That one goes right through it, and its final destination is at the distal phalange. So if a muscle crosses the joint, it has to act on the joint. So the Flexor Digitorum Profundus goes right through and crosses the wrist. So will it flex the wrist? Yeah, it'll flex the wrist. Will it flex the joint between the metacarpals and the proximal phalange, called the metacarpal phalange joint? Yes, that's over here. So it flexes the wrist. It flexes here at the main knuckles, which is called the metacarpal phalange joint. And then it crosses over, and remember you have a proximal, middle, and distal phalange. The Flexor Digitorum Profundus crosses all of these digits and inserts on the distal phalange. So that means it can flex the metacarpal phalange joint at the knuckle. It can flex the proximal interphalange joint, the pip joint, and it can flex the distal interphalange joint, the dip joint. So the Flexor Digitorum Profundus can flex the wrist, it can flex the MCPs, it can flex the pip and the dip. The tendon of the Flexor Digitorum Superficialis, it attaches to the middle phalanx. So that's going to insert here on the middle phalanx. So can that one flex the dip joint if it's not crossing the joint? Absolutely not. But it can flex everything proximal to it. Okay. This group of muscle here is called the Thenar Pad Muscles. The pinky muscles are called the Hypothenar Pad. The thenar and Hypothenar Pad muscles have what we call Oaf muscles, OAF. O is for opponens, A is for adductor, and then F is for flexor. So there's an opponens pollicus, an adductor pollicus, and a flexor pollicus. On the pinky side, there's OAF. There's an opponens digiti minimi. Digiti minimi means pinky. There's an opponens digiti minimi, an adductor digiti minimi, and a flexor digiti minimi. So we call them Oaf muscles. That makes up the thenar pad and the hypothenar pad. Okay, let's make sure what we covered here so far. So we did the arm and we did the anterior forearm. Let's look at here just to review and show you what we've done on the back side of the arm, right? We did the deltoid, that's superficial. You can see a little bit of the supraspinatus down here. Here's the infraspinatus. There's Teres Minor, Teres Major, and there's the long head of the triceps piercing between minor and major. Since we're looking at the arm from the lateral perspective, then we can see the lateral head of the triceps. Here is the long head of the triceps piercing between Teres Minor and major. Here's the lateral head. On the opposite side would be the medial head of the triceps. Okay, let's look at the posterior, again, the posterior forearm where the extensors were. Remember, the anterior side had the flexors, and just to review, the posterior side had the extensors. All the flexors originated near the medial epicondyle. They call that the common flexor tendon site. And near the lateral epicondyle, where the wrist and finger extensors started, they call it the common extensor tendon site. When people play a lot of sports, they can get medial epicondylitis or they can get lateral epicondylitis. It's just pain and inflammation on the corresponding side. Sometimes they call medial epicondylitis golfer's elbow, and sometimes they call lateral epicondylitis tennis elbow. Tennis elbow from an improper backhand. So on the back side, we see the extensor tendons. And then again, remember there's the extensor retinaculum. Here's the extensor digitorum going to digits 2, 3, and 4. And then the fifth digit has its own, called the extensor digiti minimi. The extensor digiti minimi. We can see that here. We follow this one up, and it goes to the pinky, extensor digiti minimi. This one is the extensor digitorum. You can see that it branches out, and it goes to digits 2, digit 3, digit 4, and it has a little extension here to 5. It doesn't have, it has a little branch, which is why the pinky, the extensor digiti minimi, has its own. And then here's the extensor carpi ulnaris, right there. Okay, it crosses the carpals on the ulnar side. Here's the abductor Pollicus longus, the extensor Pollicus brevis, and then the extensor Pollicus longus. Remember I said these tendons made up the anatomical snuff box. If you go thumbs up and you feel that little depression, the reason why that snuff box is of significance, it's due to trauma. A lot of people slip and fall with an outstretched hand. They land on their hand. You get that load that lands and puts a lot of pressure. And when there's deep-seated pain here at the anatomical snuff box, it's usually indicative of a scaphoid fracture. When you land with an outstretched hand and you go, oh, my wrist hurts, oh my God, it's throbbing and pain, and you go, where does it hurt? And you go, right there, and you know you're pointing to the snuff box, they'll do an x-ray and usually the scaphoid is fractured. Okay, on the posterior side, again, we could see the extensor digitorum, the extensor carpi ulnaris, and I already pointed out to you the extensor digiti minimi. Remember, extensor digiti minimi, the minimi, that one is the extensor that goes to the pinky. It has its own. Here's your anatomical snuff box muscles. It's the abductor Pollicus longus, because it has a longer tendon. It's more proximal, so it has a longer way to go to reach the thumb. Then it's an extensor Pollicus brevis, has a shorter tendon, shorter distance to the thumb. And then here's your extensor Pollicus longus. So there's your snuff box, that depression between these two tendons and that third tendon right here. There's the snuff box, and that's where the scaphoid fractures are felt. That is your extensor retinaculum holding down all of the wrist extensors and the finger extensors. Here's your adductor pollicus, the web between the thumb and the index finger or the pointer finger. That's called the adductor pollicus. It makes up the web of the finger. When it contracts, it pulls your thumb to midline, which is called adduction. Okay, and now we're looking at here's the biceps brachii, here's the cubital fossa, there's your pronator teres, which pronates. Here's a muscle called the supinator. So the supinator and the pronator, obviously, they are antagonistic to one another. Here's the flexor, not the best view. I mean, if I'm going to ask the flexor carpi radialis or extensor digitorum, I wouldn't ask it on a picture like this because I like to ask those where you can really see the full image, right? If I'm going to ask those, I want you to be able to see the full forearm and the hand so you can make it out. Is it going to the fingers? Is it crossing the wrist? Is it on the radial side or ulnar side? It helps you name the muscle. When I show those on images like this, you really can't see the orientation of what we're looking at, right? I mean, I know just because I have a better understanding of anatomy, but I mean, when you guys and gals are looking at this, you're going, what is it? Is it the calf? Is it the forearm? Give me some reference point here. I get that. I understand that. So I'll make sure when we show these images on the lab exam, you can figure out the spatial orientation and know what anatomical position is. I get it that you can't do it from this particular image. Okay, let's take a look at the same stuff, right? But let's look at the upper extremity in this position now. So now here's the lateral view, and you can self-test yourself just by looking on the right, and then we have the names here. So this is the deltoid muscle, and here's the clavicle. Here's the spine of the scapula. So this is anterior and this is posterior. So if this is the spine of the scapula, below it is the infraspinatus, above it, supraspinatus. Number 4 is Teres Minor. Number 3 is Teres Major. Now the deltoid is blocking the long head of the triceps, so we can't really see it piercing between Teres Minor and Teres Major. Here, number 9 is the biceps brachii. Number 11 is the triceps. And between the biceps and the triceps, from the lateral view, we can see the brachialis here. Okay, let's go down. Now where you can see the shoulder and the scapula, but now we're looking at the anterior scapula. So number 6 is the subscapularis. Number 8 is part of the pec major, but it's the clavicular division. We don't see the sternal division here. Number 7 is the anterior deltoid. And then here's the beginning of the biceps brachii. This portion here is the short head. This portion here, where you could see a very fine split, this would be the long head, this would be the short head, more medially going to the coracoid process. So now, here's more of a medial view. Here's the subscapularis. Here's the clavicular division of pec major. And number 3, here's the Teres Major. And Teres Major and the Latissimus Dorsi have the same insertion site. So number 5, you're seeing this little piece of muscle is just the Latissimus Dorsi is huge, right? It's a major lower back muscle. It goes from the sacrum, the pelvis, the 5 lower lumbar, the 5 lumbar vertebrae and the lower 6 thoracic vertebrae. That is a wide, large muscle, but it happens to follow and insert at the exact same place as Teres Major, which happens to be on that bicipital groove. So number 9 is the biceps brachii, and then here's the triceps brachii. Here's the forearms anterior. Here's the elbow. Right there's the bicep. We can see the bicipital aponeurosis right here. Here's the Brachioradialis, and here's the Pronator Teres. So it kind of makes like an upside down Y or a V, right? That's split. Here's the Y. So Pronator Teres, Brachioradialis. Number 13, that's your Flexor Carpi Radialis, and 14 is the Palmaris Longus. we really can't see the flexor carpi ulnaris too well because we're not looking at it from the medial view. It's more anterior and a little bit lateral. Now we're rotating the hand to the posterior side so we can see number 16, which is the extensor carpi ulnaris. Number 17, extensor digitorum. Then we have number 18, 19, and 20. 18, 19, and 20, if you were to grab your lateral forearm, you're grabbing those three muscles. It's called the mobile wad of three. It's 18, 19, and 20. 18 is the extensor carpi radialis brevis, extensor carpi radialis longus, and the brachioradialis. They all kind of originate on the same place at that lateral epicondyle. Okay, let me stop the screen share and see if we have any questions.